Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light that slanted through the carriage windows as Margaret Miller stared at the imposing three-story Victorian house at the end of the long, tree-lined drive. After nearly 2 days of travel from Richmond, the sight of their new home in rural Blackwood County, Virginia, should have brought relief. Instead, a chill crawled up her spine despite the July heat. "We're here, my dear," Thomas said, squeezing her hand. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had just quadrupled his fortune by purchasing the Blackwood lumber mill from its aging proprietor. At 35, Thomas Miller had the determined ambition of a man who'd grown up with nothing and now intended to have everything. Margaret forced a smile. "It's grand." The house loomed against the darkening sky, its numerous gables and turrets creating strange shadows across the overgrown lawn. Built by the previous mill owner in the 1850s. The house had stood mostly vacant for the past decade, visited only occasionally when business demanded. As the carriage rolled to a stop, their 5-year-old daughter Charlotte pressed her face against the window. "Mama, there's someone watching us." Margaret followed her daughter's gaze to an upper window, the small, round window of the attic, but saw nothing except a brief movement of the curtain. "Just the wind, sweetheart." Thomas helped them down from the carriage as the driver began unloading their trunks. "The rest of our belongings will arrive tomorrow," he explained to the housekeeper who'd appeared at the front door. Mrs. Winters was a severe-looking woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She had been caretaker of the property for years and had agreed to stay on when Thomas purchased the estate. "Welcome to Blackwood House, Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she said with a stiff nod. "I've prepared your rooms as requested." The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior: high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and heavy velvet draperies. Yet something about the space felt confined, as if the grandeur was meant to distract from what lay beneath. "Mrs. Winters," Margaret asked as they followed her up the main staircase, "how many staff maintained the house before?" "6, ma'am, when the Blackwoods were in residence." "Just myself and the groundskeeper, Mr. Porter, these past years." She paused at the landing. "The house has ... specific needs." "We'll be hiring additional help soon," Thomas assured her. "For now, we're grateful for your expertise." As they continued their tour, Charlotte tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Mama, I want to see upstairs," she whispered, pointing toward the narrow staircase that led to the 3rd floor. "Not now, dear. Those are just storage rooms and the servants' quarters." "But I saw someone up there," Charlotte insisted. "A man in black." Mrs. Winters' hand trembled slightly as she reached for the banister. "The child has an active imagination after the long journey. The 3rd floor is quite empty, I assure you." That night, after Charlotte had been tucked into bed in the room adjoining theirs, Margaret stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit grounds. Thomas was in the study below, already immersed in the mill's ledgers. "You'll love it here once we're settled," he had promised. Margaret wasn't so certain. Something about Blackwood House felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. A soft creak from above drew her attention. Footsteps, light but distinct, moved across the ceiling. Margaret frowned. Mrs. Winters had claimed the 3rd floor was unoccupied, yet someone was clearly walking in the space directly above her bedroom. Gathering her courage and taking a lamp, Margaret stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock below. The narrow staircase to the 3rd floor was at the far end of the corridor, its entrance partially hidden by a turn in the hallway. As she approached, Margaret noticed something odd. A small key hung from a hook beside the staircase door. The brass key looked well used, its surface polished from frequent handling. Why would an unoccupied floor need a locked door? Just as she reached for the doorknob, Mrs. Winters appeared so suddenly that Margaret gasped. "Mrs. Miller, is something the matter?" the housekeeper asked, her thin frame silhouetted against the dimly lit corridor. "I thought I heard someone moving on the 3rd floor." Mrs. Winters' expression remained impassive. "Just the house settling, ma'am. These old timbers creak something awful, especially after sunset when the temperature drops." She moved slightly, positioning herself between Margaret and the staircase door. "You should rest. The first night in a new home is always difficult." Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of how foolish she might appear. Grown woman jumping at creaks and shadows. "Of course. Good night, Mrs. Winters." As she returned to her room, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the housekeeper was watching her retreat. And just before she closed her bedroom door, she heard the distinct sound of a key turning in a lock behind her. The first week at Blackwood House passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Thomas spent most days at the mill, returning late with stories of production targets and timber contracts. Margaret busied herself directing the placement of furniture and organizing the household, while Charlotte explored the expansive gardens under the watchful eye of her new nursemaid, a local girl named Ruth. Yet the strange occurrences continued. Twice more, Margaret heard footsteps above her bedroom at night. Once, she found the door to the third-floor staircase unlocked and slightly ajar, only to have Mrs. Winters appear moments later to inform her that the upper rooms were being aired out. "The attic rooms are still quite dusty, ma'am," the housekeeper had explained. "Not suitable for a lady's inspection." It was Charlotte who first mentioned the food. "Mrs. Winters takes a tray upstairs every day," she said matter-of-factly during breakfast on their 8th day. Margaret looked up from her tea. "What do you mean, darling? A tray with food? I saw her yesterday when I was playing hide-and-seek with Ruth. She had bread and soup and carried it up the skinny stairs." Charlotte bit into her toast. "Ruth says nobody's supposed to talk about the man who lives upstairs." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Ruth told you this?" Charlotte nodded. "She said the attic man has always been there. That he's holy." She struggled with the word, clearly repeating something she'd heard. When confronted, Ruth turned pale and refused to elaborate, claiming she'd merely been entertaining the child with local folklore. But the seed of suspicion had been planted in Margaret's mind. That afternoon, while Thomas was at the mill, Margaret searched his study for the house plans. Among the property documents, she found detailed drawings of the first and second floors. But the third floor was represented by a single, empty rectangle labeled simply storage. Stranger still was what she discovered in the household account books. Every week there was an entry for provisions, upper rooms, and another for special services, FRD. The amounts were not insignificant. When Thomas returned that evening, Margaret waited until Charlotte was asleep before raising the subject. "Thomas, is someone living on the third floor of our house?" Her husband froze momentarily, then carefully set down his brandy glass. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Charlotte says Mrs. Winters takes food upstairs daily. The account books show regular provisions for the upper rooms, and I've heard footsteps, Thomas." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I had hoped to spare you this until we were more settled. The house came with certain obligations." "Obligations? What are you talking about?" "When I purchased the mill and property, part of the agreement included the continued care of a resident." Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. "A former clergyman who has been living here for decades. His presence was a non-negotiable condition of the sale." Margaret stared at her husband in disbelief. "You bought a house with a stranger living in it without telling me?" "He's confined to the third floor, completely separate from our living space. The arrangement has existed since before the Civil War, apparently. The Blackwoods considered it a private charitable matter. What's wrong with him? Why is he hidden away?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't given details. Mr. Blackwood said only that the man had experienced a crisis of faith after a tragedy and preferred seclusion. The local parish supports his care, which is why you see those entries in the accounts." Margaret felt a chill. "Why all the secrecy? Why not simply tell me? The fewer people who know, the better for his dignity and our standing in the community." Blackwood was explicit about discretion being paramount. Thomas took her hands in his. "It's a simple act of charity, Margaret. One that came with our good fortune." That night Margaret lay awake long after Thomas had fallen asleep. His explanation had answered some questions but raised others. Why was a former clergyman being kept like a prisoner? What tragedy had befallen him? And why did everyone in the household seem so afraid to speak of him? As if summoned by her thoughts, the footsteps began again above her, slow and measured, pacing the length of what must be the attic bedroom. Back and forth, back and forth. A man wearing out a path in his confinement. Then something new, a soft, rhythmic sound. It took Margaret a moment to recognize it as singing. A man's voice, deep but wavering, singing what sounded like a Latin hymn. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling like a tide, seeping through the ceiling and washing over her. Margaret slipped out of bed and pressed her ear to the wall. The singing continued, but now she could make out words among the Latin phrases, interspersed with the hymn, "The lambs, innocent lambs. Accept this offering, forgive, A floorboard creaked beneath her feet, and the singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the unsettling words. Margaret held her breath, waiting. Then came a new sound, scratching, like fingernails dragging slowly across the ceiling above, moving in her direction. Margaret backed away from the wall, her heart pounding. The scratching followed, as if whatever was above could sense her movement. When it reached the spot directly overhead, it stopped. Then a whisper, so faint she might have imagined it. "I know you're there, new mother. Bring me your lamb when the time comes." Margaret fled back to bed, shaking uncontrollably. Thomas stirred, but didn't wake. She pulled the covers tight around herself, trying to convince her racing mind that she'd imagined the voice, that it was just the wind or her exhausted brain playing tricks. But as dawn broke, bringing merciful light to the room, Margaret knew one thing with certainty. whatever, whoever lived on the third floor was not simply a retired clergyman in need of charity, and she would not rest until she discovered the truth. The following morning, Margaret watched as Mrs. Winters prepared a breakfast tray. The housekeeper moved with practiced efficiency, selecting a soft-boiled egg, toast with the crusts removed, and tea with honey, an invalid's meal. When she thought no one was looking, she added something else, a small silver cup covered with a cloth napkin. "I'll help you with that," Margaret said, stepping into the kitchen. Mrs. Winters startled, nearly dropping the tray. "Mrs. Miller, I didn't hear you come in. What's in the covered cup, Mrs. Winters?" The older woman's face hardened. "Medicine, ma'am. For our upstairs resident." "I'd like to meet him," Margaret said firmly. "My husband explained the arrangement last night." "That wouldn't be appropriate, ma'am. Father Doyle sees no one except myself and the parish priest who visits monthly for confession." "Father Doyle," Margaret repeated. "The mysterious F.R.D. from the account books. How long has he been here?" Mrs. Winters hesitated. "Since before my time. 30 years, at least. And in all those years he's never left the third floor? It's for his own good, ma'am, and for the good of others." Mrs. Winters lifted the tray. "Now, if you'll excuse me, he doesn't do well when his schedule is disrupted." As the housekeeper disappeared up the service stairs, Margaret made a decision. She would need to investigate while Thomas was away, and Mrs. Winters was occupied with her afternoon marketing in town. Later that day, Margaret seized her opportunity. With the housekeeper gone and Charlotte napping under Ruth's supervision, she took the key she'd secretly copied from the hook by the third-floor door and made her way upstairs. The narrow staircase led to a small landing with a single window that illuminated a corridor with 3 doors. 2 were unlocked and revealed nothing unusual, just dusty storage rooms filled with old furniture and trunks. The 3rd door at the end of the hallway was locked. Margaret's hand trembled as she inserted the key. The lock turned with a soft click, and she pushed the door open slowly, unsure of what or whom she might find. The room was empty. It was clearly someone's living quarters. A narrow bed with rumpled sheets, a writing desk, bookshelves filled with theological texts, and a washstand. A half-eaten breakfast sat on a small table by the window, the same window where Charlotte had claimed to see someone watching when they arrived. Margaret stepped inside, looking for clues about the mysterious Father Doyle. The room was spartanly furnished, but not uncomfortable. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on the desk, Mrs. Winters' touch, perhaps. Beside them lay an open Bible and a leather-bound journal. Margaret approached the desk cautiously. The journal was filled with neat, precise handwriting daily entries dating back years. She flipped to a recent page. July 15th, 1887. "A new family has taken residence. I observed them from my window yesterday. A man, a woman, and a young daughter. Mrs. Winters says the man has purchased the mill. The child is fair-haired and bright-eyed. 5 years old, perhaps 6. Too young yet. I must be patient." Margaret's skin crawled as she read the words. Too young for what? She turned back several pages. December 24th, 1886. Another disappointment. Mrs. Blackwood's grandchild was stillborn. Nothing to be done. The family departs tomorrow, likely for the last time. Mr. Blackwood's health fails, and Mrs. Winters says the property will be sold. What will become of our arrangement? The Lord provides, but I fear for my mission if strangers take ownership. Disturbed, Margaret flipped further back, scanning entries until a name caught her eye. April 30th, 1884. Elizabeth Blackwood brought her infant son today. Born with the call, but sickly and unlikely to survive the week. The baptism was performed according to the old rite. The offering accepted. May his innocent soul strengthen the seal. A cold dread settled in Margaret's stomach. She turned more pages, finding similar entries dating back years, names of infants, references to baptisms and offerings. Some entries mentioned stillbirths. Others described sickly newborns not expected to live. In a drawer of the desk, Margaret found another book holder, its leather binding cracked with age. This was no journal, but a formal ledger. Opening it, she found a list of names with dates beside them. Going back to 1851, each entry followed the same format. Name of child, date of birth, death, mother's name. Offering received, there were dozens of entries, page after page of them. With growing horror, Margaret realized these were records of dead or dying infants brought to Father Doyle over decades. The sound of a door opening downstairs jolted Margaret back to the present. Mrs. Winters had returned early. Quickly she replaced the ledger and journal exactly as she'd found them and slipped out of the room, locking the door behind her. Heart pounding, she had just reached the bottom of the stairs when Mrs. Winters emerged from the kitchen. "Mrs. Miller," the housekeeper said, her gaze immediately going to the key in Margaret's hand. "I see you've been exploring. "What is happening in this house?" Margaret demanded, past the point of pretense. "What is Father Doyle doing with dead infants?" Mrs. Winter's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. "You wouldn't understand. It's a matter of faith." "Faith? There's a man recording the deaths of babies in my attic." "Father Doyle provides a service to the community," Mrs. Winters said quietly. "A sacred service that the church itself cannot officially sanction, but that many families have found necessary." "What service?" Margaret whispered, though she feared she already knew. "Insurance, Mrs. Miller. Spiritual insurance." The housekeeper stepped closer. When a child is born marked for death, sickly, malformed, or stillborn, the parents face not only grief but terror. What becomes of an unbaptized soul? The church offers little comfort there. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "So they bring their dead or dying infants to a man locked in an attic?" "Father Doyle was once the most respected priest in the county, until he began offering a more ancient form of baptism for these lost souls. One that guarantees their salvation but requires sacrifice the church considers heretical." Mrs. Winters spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing nothing more controversial than a recipe. When the bishop discovered his practices, Father Doyle was removed from his position. The Blackwood family, who had benefited from his services, offered him sanctuary. "This is madness," Margaret whispered. "Perhaps, but for 36 years, Father Doyle has ensured that no child from Blackwood County dies without certainty of heaven. The families bring their dying infants, or sometimes just their remains. He performs the rite. He takes their sin upon himself." Mrs. Winters' voice had taken on a reverent quality. "A sacrifice for a sacrifice. And what happens to the remains?" Mrs. Winters' gaze didn't waver. "Everything is returned to the earth in consecrated ground. Father Doyle sees to it personally." Margaret felt sick. "Thomas knows about this?" "Mr. Miller knows that Father Doyle is a retired clergyman who provides spiritual comfort to families in distress. The specifics were not necessary for him to understand his obligations as the new proprietor. I want him gone from this house. Today." Mrs. Winters shook her head slowly. "That's not possible, Mrs. Miller. Father Doyle's presence here is known to every family of consequence in the county. His services are still sought after, still needed. Your husband's position in the community depends on honoring the arrangement. These are barbaric superstitions. In 1887, say what you will," Mrs. Winters replied calmly. "But should tragedy ever befall your own family, should you ever find yourself holding a child who entered this world only to leave it, you might find comfort in knowing that Father Doyle is just upstairs, ready to ensure that little soul's journey to paradise." The grandfather clock in the hall struck 4, breaking the tension between them. "Charlotte will be waking from her nap," Mrs. Winters said, "and Mr. Miller will be home for dinner soon. I suggest we both attend to our duties and speak of this another time." As the housekeeper turned toward the kitchen, Margaret called after her, "There's something you're not telling me." Mrs. Winters paused but didn't turn around. "There are many things I'm not telling you, Mrs. Miller. Some truths are better learned slowly." She continued walking, adding over her shoulder, "Lock that door when you go up to your daughter. Father Doyle sometimes wanders when he thinks everyone is asleep." That night, Margaret confronted Thomas in his study, recounting everything she had discovered in her disturbing conversation with Mrs. Winters. "You must have known more than you told me," she concluded, pacing before his desk. "Did you know families were bringing dead babies to her attic?" Thomas looked shaken. "I knew only that he performed some kind of blessing for infants unlikely to survive. Old Mr. Blackwood described it as a comfort to grieving parents." He ran his hands through his hair. "Margaret, we can't simply evict an elderly clergyman who's lived here for decades. The scandal would ruin us before we've even established ourselves." "The scandal?" "Thomas, there are records of dead infants in our house. Whatever this man is doing, it isn't simple blessing." "Let me speak with him," Thomas said. "Perhaps there's an explanation that would set your mind at ease." "Nothing could set my mind at ease except his removal from this house." Margaret lowered her voice. "Did you read what I told you?" "He wrote about Charlotte, too young yet." "Too young for what, Thomas?" Her husband sighed heavily. "I'll look into it. Tomorrow I'll speak with Reverend Elliot from St. Mark's. If there's anything improper occurring under our roof, we'll address it appropriately." But Margaret saw the calculation in his eyes. Thomas had sacrificed too much, worked too hard to secure their position. He wouldn't risk it all based on what could be dismissed as a woman's hysterical fears. That night she locked their bedroom door and moved a chair against it. Thomas said nothing, though his disapproving look spoke volumes. Margaret couldn't bring herself to care about his disapproval. Not when Charlotte slept just one room away and a man who collected dead infants lived above them. Sleep came fitfully. Each creak of the old house jolted Margaret awake. Around midnight she heard it, the now familiar footsteps overhead, back and forth, then silence. Margaret lay rigid in bed, straining to hear. Thomas slept soundly beside her, his breathing deep and regular. Outside an owl hooted and a breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree near their window. Then came a new sound, a soft creak on the stairs. Not the stairs to the attic, but the main staircase leading to the second-floor bedrooms, to their bedroom, to Charlotte's room. Margaret slipped from bed and pressed her ear to the door. Another creak, closer now. The sound of breathing in the hallway. Then the gentle turning of Charlotte's doorknob. So without hesitation, Margaret flung open her door. A tall figure in a black cassock stood at Charlotte's door, hand on the knob. In the dim light of the oil lamp she carried, Margaret could see he was an elderly man with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes. His white hair hung long and unkempt around his shoulders. "Step away from my daughter's room," Margaret commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Father Doyle turned slowly to face her. Despite his age, he stood straight, his bearing almost regal. "You must be Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was merely checking on the child. You have no right to be near her. Go back upstairs immediately, or I'll wake my husband." The old priest smiled faintly. "Your husband understands the importance of my work, even if he doesn't fully comprehend it. As will you, in time." "I understand enough," Margaret replied coldly. "I've read your ledgers." Something flashed in Father Doyle's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or pity. "Then, I am a shepherd of lost lambs, a guardian of innocent souls. You're a collector of dead infants. I am a servant of God who offers certainty where the church offers only fear." He stepped away from Charlotte's door, moving with surprising grace for his age. "The church teaches that unbaptized infants go to limbo, neither heaven nor hell, but eternal separation from God's presence. I offer a more merciful alternative." "By what authority?" Father Doyle's smile widened. "By the oldest authority, Mrs. Miller, before your church, before your Bible. There were ways to ensure safe passage for innocent souls, ways that require sacrifice." "Stay away from my daughter," Margaret warned, raising the lamp higher. "Your Charlotte is in no danger from me," he said softly. "Not yet. She's healthy, vibrant with life. My concern is for the child you carry now." Margaret froze. "What? You don't know yet?" Father Doyle's eyes seemed to look through her. 6 weeks, perhaps 7, but already I sense its fragility, its struggle." He took a step toward her, his hands clasped before him as if in prayer. "When the bleeding starts, and it will, remember that I can ensure your child's soul reaches paradise." Margaret backed away, one hand instinctively going to her abdomen. "You're insane." "I am devoted," he corrected. "For 36 years, I have been the shepherd of souls that would otherwise be lost. I have baptized 342 infants in the old way. I have fed their remains to consecrated ground and taken their mortal sins upon myself so they might enter heaven unburdened." Horror washed over Margaret as the priest's meaning became clear. "You consume them." Father Doyle's expression remained serene. "The body and blood, Mrs. Miller, the oldest sacrament. Not the symbolic wafer and wine of modern communion, but the true sacrifice." He gestured toward the ceiling. "Why do you think I must remain apart? Why I must be fed and cared for like a secret? I carry the weight of hundreds of souls within me. I am their salvation and their prison." The lamp trembled in Margaret's hand. "Get back upstairs now, or I swear I'll scream this house down." The priest studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "As you wish. But remember what I've told you when your time comes." He turned and walked toward the service stairs, his cassock whispering against the floorboards. At the staircase door he paused. "They all resist at first. Then they understand the mercy I offer." When he had gone, Margaret rushed to Charlotte's room. Her daughter slept peacefully, unaware of the conversation that had taken place outside her door. Margaret sank into the chair beside the bed, trembling. Was it possible she was with child again? There had been signs, fatigue, tenderness, but she had attributed them to the stress of the move. And if she was pregnant, was the child truly in danger as the priest had predicted? Or was that simply a cruel manipulation to frighten her into accepting his presence? By morning, Margaret had made her decision. She would take Charlotte and return to Richmond immediately, with or without Thomas's blessing. She would not spend another night under the same roof as Father Doyle, but as she rose to begin packing, a sharp, cramping pain doubled her over. When she looked down, she saw a spreading stain of red on her nightgown. The bleeding didn't stop. For 3 days, Margaret drifted between consciousness and fevered dreams, aware only of the pain. The doctor's grave face and Thomas's increasingly desperate prayers. "It's a difficult miscarriage," she heard Dr. Lambert tell her husband in the hallway. "The child was malformed. It happens sometimes. If the bleeding doesn't ease soon, we may lose her too." In her moments of lucidity, Margaret saw Mrs. Winters hovering at the edges of the room, her thin lips pressed together in what might have been concern or vindication. Once she thought she heard the housekeeper whispering to Thomas, "Father Doyle could help. He has knowledge of such matters." "No," Margaret tried to say, but her voice was too weak to be heard. On the 4th day, as a gray dawn broke over Blackwood House, Margaret awoke to find a figure sitting beside her bed. Not Thomas or the doctor, but Father Doyle, his gaunt face solemn in the dim light. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, too weak to feel proper fear. "Your husband invited me," the priest replied quietly. "Against my counsel, the doctor performed a scraping procedure yesterday to remove what remained of the infant. But something was left behind. I can sense it." Margaret tried to sit up but couldn't find the strength. "Get out. I can save you, Mrs. Miller, but I need what remains of your child to do it properly. You're not touching my baby." Father Doyle leaned closer. "Your baby is already gone, torn to pieces by the doctor's instruments. What remains is poisoning your blood." His voice softened. "Let me perform the rite. Let me ensure your child's soul reaches heaven, and in doing so cleanse your body of death." "No." Margaret turned her face away. "Then you will die," he said simply, "and Charlotte will grow up without a mother." The mention of her daughter pierced Margaret's resolve. Charlotte needed her, and if what the priest said was true, if something remained inside her that the doctor had missed, perhaps this was her only chance. "What would you do?" she asked finally. "A simple ritual. Holy water, blessed oil, the sacrament." Father Doyle's eyes never left her face. "And then I would take what remains and ensure its proper sanctification." "You mean you would ... She couldn't bring herself to say it. "I would consume death so that life might continue. Your life, Mrs. Miller." Margaret closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And my child's soul?" "Safely delivered to paradise, untouched by sin." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, a mockingbird sang its morning repertoire, the sound painfully beautiful against the backdrop of death that filled the room. "If I agree," Margaret said finally, "I want your word that you will never approach Charlotte again. Never so much as look at her." "You have my sacred oath," Father Doyle replied solemnly. "Your daughter will live a long and blessed life, as will any future children you bear. And when you die, what happens to your arrangement with this house?" A strange smile crossed the priest's face. "I've already identified my successor among the younger clergy. The tradition will continue." Margaret felt a chill despite the fever that burned through her. How many generations had this been happening? How many families had made this same desperate bargain? "Very well," she whispered. "Do what you must." Father Doyle nodded and stood. "I'll need privacy for the sacrament, and afterward you must rest undisturbed until morning." He left briefly, returning with Mrs. Winters, who carried a basin of water, towels, and a small ornate box. The housekeeper avoided Margaret's gaze as she set the items on the bedside table. "Leave us," Father Doyle instructed, and Mrs. Winters departed without a word. What followed was both sacred and profane prayers in Latin, mingled with touches that made Margaret flinch despite her weakened state. The priest anointed her forehead, hands, and abdomen with oil that smelled of rosemary and something metallic. He sprinkled water that burned like ice where it touched her skin. Then came the worst part. Margaret screamed once as Father Doyle's hands pressed into her abdomen, manipulating something inside her with terrible precision. A gush of blood and tissue followed, which he collected in the basin with practiced efficiency. "It is done," he said at last, covering the basin with a cloth. "The corruption is removed." As darkness claimed her, Margaret heard the priest's final words. "Rest now, Mrs. Miller. By morning, death will have passed over your house." She awoke to sunlight and the sensation of cool, clean sheets against her skin. The fever had broken. The pain had subsided to a dull ache. On the bedside table sat a vase of fresh wildflowers, not Mrs. Winters' formal arrangement, but a child's gathering, bright and slightly crushed. "Charlotte picked those for you," Thomas said from the doorway, his face haggard but smiling with relief. "Dr. Lambert was here at dawn. He says the fever is broken and you should recover fully with rest." "Father Doyle," Margaret began, unsure how to ask what had happened after she lost consciousness. Thomas's expression sobered. "He stayed with you through the night, praying." The doctor was astonished at the improvement this morning. He approached the bed and took her hand. "Margaret, I know you had reservations, but we owe him your life. Had it really been just prayers that saved her? Or had the priest's gruesome ritual actually worked? Margaret couldn't bring herself to ask for details she didn't truly want confirmed. "Where is Charlotte?" she asked instead, with Ruth in the garden. "She's been asking for you constantly. Bring her to me, please." As Thomas left to fetch their daughter, Margaret gazed out the window at the summer sky. Whatever had happened, whatever bargain she had struck in her desperation, she had survived. Charlotte would have her mother, and Father Doyle would remain in the attic, performing his ancient rites for other desperate families, keeping his distance from her daughter as promised. The cost had been high, paid in blood and something even more precious. But as Charlotte burst into the room moments later, her small face alight with joy, Margaret knew she would pay it again if necessary. For this was Blackwood House, a place of shadows and secrets, of ancient bargains and terrible mercies. And she was now bound to it as surely as the priest was bound to his attic room, each of them carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. By October, Margaret had recovered her strength. The crisp autumn air and fiery foliage of the Virginia countryside offered a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere that had pervaded Blackwood House since her illness. True to his word, Father Doyle had maintained his distance, rarely venturing from the third floor except for his nighttime wanderings, which now seemed confined to hours when Charlotte was safely asleep. Thomas had thrown himself into the lumber business, expanding operations and establishing himself among the county's elite. He spoke little of what had transpired during Margaret's illness, as if acknowledging it might somehow invite a return of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. But Margaret could not forget. Each night she lay awake listening for footsteps above, wondering about the fate of the child she had lost and about the others who had come before. The questions haunted her. How long had this arrangement existed? How many families in Blackwood County had surrendered their dead or dying infants to Father Doyle's care? And most disturbing of all, where were the remains? One crisp morning in late October, Margaret decided to seek answers. With Thomas at the mill and Charlotte engaged in lessons with her new tutor, she ordered the carriage prepared. "Where shall I tell the driver to take you, ma'am?" Mrs. Winters asked, her tone carefully neutral. "St. Mark's Church," Margaret replied. "I wish to speak with Reverend Elliot about joining the congregation." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, but she merely nodded. "As you wish, St. Mark's Episcopal Church stood at the center of Blackwood Village, its white steeple rising above the surrounding buildings like an accusing finger pointed at heaven. The church dated back to colonial times, its graveyard filled with moss-covered stones bearing the names of the county's founding families. Reverend James Elliot received Margaret in his study, a small room adjacent to the sanctuary that smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. "Mrs. Miller, what a pleasure," he said, rising from his desk. "Your husband mentioned you might call once you were feeling stronger." "Thank you for seeing me, Reverend," Margaret said, taking the offered seat. "I've been curious about the church's history since moving to Blackwood." "A fascinating subject," the Reverend replied. "The parish dates back to 1742. Many of the county's most prominent families have worshipped here for generations." "Including the Blackwoods?" "Oh yes, particularly in the last 40 years or so," he smiled. "Before that, they were somewhat irregular in their attendance, from what I understand. I'm also interested in the clergy who have served here," Margaret continued carefully. "I believe there was a priest named Father Doyle at one time." Reverend Elliot's expression clouded. "Where did you hear that name?" "I believe he was mentioned by Mrs. Winters." "A former priest who left under some controversy?" The Reverend studied her for a moment before responding. "Daniel Doyle was never officially assigned to St. Mark's. He served briefly at St. Augustine's, the Catholic mission on the other side of the county, in the late 1840s. He cleared his throat. But he was removed from his position due to unorthodox practices." "What sort of practices?" "Mrs. Miller, these are matters from before my time here. Ancient history, really." "Please, Reverend. As the new mistress of Blackwood House, I feel I should understand its connections to the community." Elliot sighed. "Very well. Father Doyle was found to be performing unauthorized rituals for grieving families, specifically those who had lost infants before baptism could be performed." He lowered his voice. "The Catholic Church teaches that such souls go to limbo rather than heaven. It's a harsh doctrine that many find difficult to accept." "And Father Doyle offered an alternative?" "He claimed to have discovered ancient rites that could ensure salvation for these unbaptized souls, rites that the church had supposedly suppressed." Elliot's expression was grim. When his bishop discovered what he was doing, Doyle was immediately removed from his position and excommunicated. The scandal nearly destroyed St. Augustine's, yet he remained in the county. The Blackwood family gave him sanctuary. Old Edmund Blackwood's first wife had lost several infants, you see. Rumor has it she was one of Doyle's first parishioners, if you will. The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Miller, may I ask why you're inquiring about this unfortunate history? Margaret chose her words carefully. I've heard ... whispers. About babies being brought to Blackwood House. About rituals performed in secret. Reverend Elliot's face paled. Those practices ended decades ago, surely. The old priest must be very much alive, Margaret finished, and still residing at Blackwood House. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Impossible, Elliot whispered finally. The man would be nearly 90 years old. Yet he walks the halls at night and maintains detailed records of his ... services. Margaret leaned forward. Reverend, I need to know what he's been doing all these years. What exactly these rituals entail. The Reverend stood abruptly. I cannot speak of such things. They border on heresy at best and something far darker at worst. He moved to a bookshelf and pulled down a dusty, leather-bound volume. But perhaps this might provide some answers. It's a history of the parish written by my predecessor in 1869. There's a chapter devoted to the Doyle scandal. Margaret accepted the book with trembling hands. Thank you, Mrs. Miller, Elliot said as she rose to leave. Whatever you discover, be careful. There are forces in this world that should not be disturbed. That evening, after Charlotte was asleep, Margaret locked herself in Thomas's study and opened the parish history. The chapter on Father Doyle was brief, but disturbing. According to the account, Daniel Doyle had arrived in Virginia from Ireland in 1845, claiming to have studied at seminaries in both Dublin and Rome. He had quickly gained a reputation for his eloquence and apparent devotion. But there had been rumors, whispers of ancient texts he'd brought with him, of midnight rituals performed in the woods, of desperate parents seeking him out after losing children, when finally confronted by his superiors. Doyle had not denied the accusations, but had instead defended his practices as older and more authentic than the Church's official rites. The most disturbing passage came near the end. During the investigation of Father Doyle's quarters at St. Augustine's, several troubling items were discovered: a silver chalice inscribed with symbols unknown to church scholars, a knife with an ivory handle carved in the likeness of a lamb, and most distressing of all, a small metal box containing what appeared to be human bone fragments. When questioned about these items, Doyle claimed they were essential tools for consuming death and transforming it into eternal life. The implication of his statements was too horrific to include in this record. Margaret closed the book, her mind racing. Consuming death. The same phrase Father Doyle had used during her illness. The priest hadn't been speaking metaphorically. He had meant it literally. But there was something else troubling her now. According to the parish history, Doyle had arrived in Virginia in 1845, already an ordained priest. Yet Mrs. Winters had mentioned that he had been performing his rituals at Blackwood House for 36 years, since 1851. That would mean he had been relatively young when confined to the attic, perhaps in his 40s. The man Margaret had seen, however, was elderly, at least in his 80s. If he had been active as a priest in the 1840s, he would have to be well over 100 years old by now. Unless a terrible suspicion formed in Margaret's mind. What if the consumption of these infants, this consuming death, was more than a ritual? What if it somehow sustained him beyond a natural lifespan? The door to the study opened suddenly, making Margaret jump. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression concerned. Margaret, are you all right? Mrs. Winters said you visited the church today. She closed the book quickly. Just learning more about local history. Thomas entered and sat across from her. You shouldn't trouble yourself with the past. We have a bright future here. He reached for her hand. I have good news. The Blackwood Lumber Company has secured a contract to supply timber for the new railway extension. We'll be doubling our workforce by spring. That's wonderful, Margaret said mechanically. And there's more, Thomas smiled. The Prestons have invited us to dine next Saturday. They're the most prominent family in the county now that the Blackwoods have departed. Their acceptance is a significant step for us. I'll look forward to it. Thomas studied her face. Margaret, I know the past months have been difficult. Your illness, the loss of the baby, ... He squeezed her hand. But we must move forward. Blackwood House is our home now. Our future, is it? Margaret pulled her hand away. How can we build a future in a house with such secrets? Such darkness? Every great house has its shadows, Thomas replied. The arrangement with Father Doyle is unusual, yes, but it's part of our obligation to the community. The Prestons understand this. The Richardsons, the Caldwells, all the old families accept it as necessary. Necessary? Margaret's voice rose. Thomas, do you even know what he does with those infants? Her husband's expression hardened. I know enough. He provides comfort to families in their darkest hour. Beyond that, I don't inquire. He consumes them, Thomas. He told me himself when I was ill. Thomas stood abruptly. That's enough, Margaret. You were delirious with fever. Whatever you think you heard, I know what I heard, she insisted. And I've been researching. The parish records confirm. Stop. Thomas's voice was like steel. This obsession must end. We have achieved everything we worked for: position, respect, influence. I won't let you jeopardize it with hysterical accusations. Hysterical? Margaret rose to face him. Is that what you think this is? I think you suffered a traumatic loss and haven't fully recovered. His tone softened slightly. Perhaps we should consult Dr. Lambert about a tonic for your nerves. Margaret stared at her husband, suddenly seeing him as a stranger. The ambitious man she had married was willing to overlook any horror, any abomination, to maintain his precious position. My nerves are perfectly sound, she said coldly. But I won't pretend that what's happening in this house is normal or acceptable, not even for you, Thomas. She brushed past him and headed upstairs, her mind racing with plans. If Thomas wouldn't help her, she would have to find another way to uncover the full truth about Father Doylan, to end his unholy practices once and for all. The Preston estate rivaled Blackwood House in grandeur, its columned facade gleaming white in the light of carriage lamps as Thomas and Margaret arrived for dinner that Saturday evening. Charlotte had remained at home under Ruth's care, with strict instructions to keep her bedroom door locked until they returned. Remember, this evening is crucial for our standing, Thomas murmured as they ascended the marble steps. The Prestons are connected to everyone who matters in the county. Margaret nodded silently. She had dressed carefully in her finest burgundy silk gown, her hair arranged in an elegant chignon. Quote, if her husband wanted her to play the role of the perfect wife tonight, she would oblige, while pursuing her own agenda. Quote, Evelyn Preston, a handsome woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair, welcomed them warmly. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, how delightful. We've been so looking forward to properly meeting the new owners of Blackwood House. The pleasure is ours, Mrs. Preston, Margaret replied with a practiced smile. Please, call me Evelyn. We're not formal among friends. She lowered her voice. And I consider anyone who maintains the old traditions a friend indeed. Margaret felt a chill at the words, but maintained her composure. As they were led into a magnificent drawing room where several other guests were already gathered. Judge Caldwell and his wife, Dr. and Mrs. Lambert, the banker Mr. Richardson and his young wife, and a distinguished-looking man introduced as Bishop Harrington of the Richmond Diocese. Bishop Harrington is visiting to consecrate our new parish hall, Evelyn explained. We were honored he accepted our dinner invitation. Throughout the elaborate meal that followed, Margaret observed the dynamics around the table. These were the elite of Blackwood County, educated, cultured, and bound together by ties that went beyond mere social connection. They spoke of business ventures and local politics, of marriages and births and deaths, all with an undercurrent of shared understanding. When the ladies withdrew to the parlor after dinner, leaving the men to their brandy and cigars, Margaret saw her opportunity. Your home is magnificent, Evelyn, she began. It reminds me of Blackwood House in many ways. Both were built in more gracious times, Evelyn replied, though I imagine you're still adjusting to the unique aspects of your new residence. The other women exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. You mean Father Doyle, Margaret said directly. A tense silence fell over the group. It was Mrs. Caldwell who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You've met him, then? Yes, during my illness. Understanding passed between the women. Mrs. Richardson, the youngest among them, reached unconsciously for her abdomen, a gesture Margaret recognized all too well. Then you know, Evelyn said softly, about his purpose. I know he performs rituals for dead or dying infants, Margaret replied. What I don't understand is why you all permit it to continue. Mrs. Lambert, the doctor's wife, leaned forward. You suffered a loss recently, I believe. Margaret nodded. And Father Doyle attended you? Yes. Then you received his blessing. His intervention. Mrs. Lambert's eyes held a fervent light. You survived when my husband thought you would not. The child's soul was secured. These are not small mercies, Mrs. Miller. But at what cost? Margaret pressed. Do any of you know what actually happens to the remains of those infants? The women exchanged uncomfortable glances. They are sanctified, Evelyn said firmly. Transformed from vessels of potential damnation to assured salvation. He consumes them, Margaret stated flatly. He told me himself. Mrs. Richardson gasped, but the older women seemed unsurprised. The sacrament takes many forms, Mrs. Caldwell said carefully. The church offers bread and wine as the body and blood. Father Doyle's rite is more direct. It's cannibalism, Margaret whispered. horrified at their calm acceptance. "It's salvation," Evelyn countered. "The first 3 children died before they could be baptized. The church offered no comfort, only the terrible uncertainty of limbo. Father Doyle gave me peace. He took their sin upon himself so they could enter heaven unstained. And has it occurred to none of you to question why a man performing such rituals for over 30 years still lives? Why he doesn't age as he should?" A heavy silence fell over the room. "He has aged," Mrs. Lambert said finally. Just slowly. "My grandmother knew him when he first came to Blackwood House," Mrs. Caldwell added. "She said he was middle-aged then. Now he's elderly, as one would expect." "But still alive," Margaret insisted. "Still capable of performing his rituals." "By God's grace," Evelyn said firmly, "for as long as he is needed." Margaret looked around at the women-educated, refined ladies who had accepted this abomination as normal, even necessary. What hold did Father Doyle have over them? What terrible fear of their children's damnation drove them to such extremes? "And none of you has ever spoken out, questioned this arrangement?" Mrs. Richardson, who had remained silent until now, spoke in a trembling voice. "My mother tried when I was a girl. She was from Richmond, not raised with our traditions. When her first child was stillborn, she refused Father Doyle's services. Her eyes filled with tears. The baby was buried in unconsecrated ground. That night my mother dreamed of her infant suffering, crying out, lost in darkness. The dreams continued for months until she nearly lost her mind." "Dreams can be powerful," Margaret acknowledged. "But they're not reality, aren't they?" Mrs. Richardson countered. "When she finally relented and allowed Father Doyle to perform his ritual on the exhumed remains, the dreams stopped immediately. She never questioned our ways again." Before Margaret could respond, the men rejoined them, bringing an end to the unsettling conversation. For the remainder of the evening, she observed the interactions with new awareness. These families were bound by more than social ties. They were participants in a dark covenant that had sustained itself for generations. As they prepared to depart, Bishop Harrington approached Margaret. "Mrs. Miller, might I have a brief word?" Thomas, engaged in conversation with Judge Caldwell, nodded his approval, and Margaret stepped aside with the bishop. "I couldn't help but notice your interest in local religious practices," the bishop said quietly. "Evelyn mentioned you were asking about certain traditional observances. You mean Father Doyle?" The bishop's expression remained neutral. "I am aware of certain unorthodox practices that persist in rural parishes. The church has always struggled with the integration of folk beliefs, particularly those concerning unbaptized infants." "This goes beyond folk belief, Bishop Harrington. I know exactly what it is, Mrs. Miller," he interrupted, his voice dropping further. "The Diocese of Richmond has been aware of Daniel Doyle since his excommunication in 1851. Several bishops, including myself, have attempted to investigate the situation at Blackwood House." Margaret's heart raced. "Then you know the truth?" "I know that each time we have sent someone to confront him, they have either been turned away by the family harboring him or have returned changed. Convinced of the necessity of his work." The bishop's eyes held a troubled look. "The last priest I sent to investigate was Father Martin. He now serves as Doyle's assistant and apparent successor." "There's another priest involved?" Margaret asked, startled. "A young man who arrived last year. The official story is that he's on sabbatical, recovering from illness." Bishop Harrington glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Mrs. Miller, I believe something unholy is occurring at Blackwood House. Something that has corrupted not just Doyle, but generations of families in this county." "Then help me stop it," Margaret pleaded. "I intend to. But we must proceed carefully. These families wield considerable influence, and they believe deeply in Doyle's power." He pressed a small card into her hand. "This is my direction in Richmond. Write to me if you discover anything concrete, anything that would justify official intervention." As their carriage rolled back toward Blackwood House through the moonlit countryside, Thomas was in high spirits. "A successful evening," he declared. "Preston practically offered me a partnership in his banking venture. And did you see how the bishop singled you out? Your charm has won them all over, Margaret." She stared out the window at the passing shadows, thinking of the bishop's troubled eyes and the women's calm acceptance of horror. "They're all complicit," she said quietly. "Every family we met tonight has brought their dead children to Father Doyle." Thomas's smile faded. "Margaret, we agreed not to speak of this. No, you demanded I remain silent, but I cannot, Thomas." She turned to face him. "There's more happening than you know. The bishop himself believes something unholy is occurring in our home." "The bishop spoke to you of Father Doyle?" Thomas asked sharply. "He knows of him. The diocese has been trying to investigate for years." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "What exactly did he say?" "That previous investigators have been turned away or return changed. That there's now a second priest involved, Father Martin, supposedly on sabbatical." "Martin." Thomas murmured. Mrs. Winters mentioned a visiting clergy member who sometimes assists with household matters. I assumed he was from the local parish. He's being groomed as Doyle's successor, Margaret said. Don't you see the pattern, Thomas? This has been happening for generations. It will continue indefinitely unless someone stops it. The carriage turned onto the long drive leading to Blackwood House. In the moonlight, the structure looked more fortress than home, its many windows like watchful eyes. What would you have me do? Thomas asked finally. Evict an elderly priest based on rumors and superstition? Risk our position in the community? I would have you protect our daughter, Margaret replied, and honor the child we lost by ensuring no more infants suffer this fate. Thomas stared at the approaching house, his expression troubled. Let me think on it. Perhaps there's a way to end the arrangement gradually, without scandal. It wasn't the firm commitment Margaret had hoped for, but it was a start. As the carriage stopped before their front door, she felt a flicker of hope that Thomas might finally be seeing reason. That hope died as they entered the house and found Mrs. Winters waiting in the foyer, her face ashen. What is it? Thomas demanded. Has something happened? It's Charlotte, the housekeeper said. She's gone. Ruth fell asleep, and when she woke, the child's bed was empty. Margaret's world tilted beneath her. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Without waiting for Thomas, she gathered her skirts and raced up the stairs, calling her daughter's name. Charlotte's room was empty, the covers thrown back as if she had risen in haste. On the pillow lay a small wooden figure, lamb, crudely carved. Margaret knew with terrible certainty where her daughter had been taken. She ran toward the service stairs that led to the third floor, Thomas and Mrs. Winters following close behind. Margaret, wait, Thomas called. We don't know. I know exactly where she is, Margaret cried, reaching for the key that hung by the door. But the hook was empty, the key already taken. She pounded on the door. Father Doyle, open this door immediately. Silence answered her. Thomas caught up, breathing heavily. Mrs. Winters, do you have another key? He demanded. The housekeeper shook her head. Only Father Doyle and Father Martin have keys. Then get an axe, Thomas ordered. Porter keeps one in the tool shed. As Mrs. Winters hurried away, Margaret pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound from above. At first there was nothing, then faintly she heard it singing. A child's voice, sweet and clear, singing a hymn Margaret had taught Charlotte herself. She's alive, Margaret gasped. Thomas, I can hear her. He joined her at the door, listening. His face hardened with determination. Stand back, he said, then threw his shoulder against the door. It shuddered but held firm. Mrs. Winters returned with the groundskeeper, who carried a heavy axe. Sir, are you certain? The man began. Break it down, Thomas ordered. Now. The groundskeeper hesitated only briefly before swinging the axe against the door. The old wood splintered, and after several powerful blows, the lock gave way. Margaret pushed past the men and rushed up the narrow stairs, heedless of danger, driven by maternal terror. Behind her, Thomas called for her to wait, but she couldn't stop, not with Charlotte so close. At the top of the stairs, the door to Father Doyle's room stood open. Margaret burst through, then froze at the threshold, unable to comprehend the scene before her. This was only the beginning. The darkness continues in part 2. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.